this is a big deal. And we'll talk a little bit more about the machinations in the National Labor Relations Board and the sort of the, I don't know if it was an F-up by Biden and Schumer or, we want to shut down the National Labor Relations Board. I'm not sure. We'll talk about that with Meyerson. But let's talk about this ruling. About, was it 50 years ago? No. Probably closer to 80 years ago, 1948. I can't do math. There was a labor doctrine that was developed by the National Labor Relations Board, which was essentially what it was known about 10 years ago as card check. So when you want to unionize your shop, what is involved is you need to submit these union vote authorization cards that you get people to sign. And if enough people sign those cards in your shop, it doesn't get you a union, but it starts the process of getting an election. Now, once that happens, as it stands now, your boss can say, I'm going to voluntarily recognize the union. Or they can say, well, we need to have an election. And then what they do is they use that interim period to either slightly or aggressively union bust.
Mm-hmm. And the aggressive stuff is like firing people in retaliation for trying to unionize, for example.
Exactly. Now, the back during the Joy Silk era, if a majority of workers in your company, and one of the things I want to ask Harold Meyerson is like how it's determined who the union unit is, essentially, who constitutes a legitimate worker that can be part of the union. But putting that aside, if a majority of the workers sign authorization cards back under the Joy Silk doctrine, the employer had to show a good faith doubt as to the authenticity of the cards and the veracity of the claim that there was support for the union. This decision doesn't quite do what the Joy Silk doctrine did. That was just card check. What it does is it says, when there is a majority of employees signed cards, the employer must do one of two things. One, they have to recognize and bargain with the union. Or two, promptly, and promptly means within 2 weeks, file a petition to test the employee's support for the union if the union has not already filed for an election. So that means that there needs to be some type of election. Now, if the employer commits any unfair labor practice that requires setting aside the election, which has happened on multiple occasions. In fact, it happened in the Cemex case. The Cemex case, the Teamsters went and said, hey, we lost this union election, but in the interim from the card authorization to the election, there were multiple instances of them breaking labor laws in terms of retaliatory and union busting practices. And the National Labor Relations Board found that, yes, that was the case. And they passed a threshold, because these violations were so blatant, they passed a threshold in which the National Labor Relations Board would set aside the election and call for a new one. Now, you remember this happened with one of the Amazon, not the first one, but one of the Amazon, the one in Alabama. Was that what it was?
Bessemer?
In Bessemer, yes. Yeah. Bessemer, there was 2 elections. And because they found that after the first election, the National Labor Relations Board found that that Amazon was engaged in practices that were union busting. I can't remember exactly what they were, but they were probably forced meetings. There was other things. And they called for a second election, and that election was lost. Under this new Cemex decision, Cemex doctrine, what would have happened is they would immediately, as soon as they, those union busting things were done, the the union would have submitted to National Labor Relations Board, and the board would say, there's no election. There's a union now.
Yeah.
That you are now penalized. So it gives a little more room for the employer to sort of like challenge the idea of a union, but it maintains a very, very specific behavioral requirements of the employer, or you just end up going into full-on union. You got to go bargain. So you don't have to, and it lowered the threshold, again, to issue a bargaining order rather than rerun the election if it finds employer committed unfair labor practices. Promptly, again, 2 weeks with the union's demand for recognition. And the board stated it will rely on current factors it uses to determine whether an election should be set aside due to unfair labor practices committed by employer, including 1, the number and severity of unfair labor practices, and 2, the proximity of those unfair labor practices to the timing of the election. And also the size of the bargaining unit and the margin of the vote, which theoretically would not take place in this instance unless, they're reviewing after the fact, and the number of employees the misconduct reach. So they're using more or less the same standards they have now in which they would reissue a vote. But instead, if that's triggered, you just get the union. Should an employer refuse to recognize and bargain with the union once they get these cards, and also fail to timely file the petition, that's 2 weeks, a union can file an unfair labor practice for refusing to bargain with the union, and that begins an issuance of a bargaining order. Yep.
So essentially, and I'm just trying to understand fully myself here, if in the period after the election is called for, the employer engages in union busting tactics, essentially card check is triggered.
Yes, and exactly. If between the time that the cards are delivered and the employer says we're not going to voluntarily recognize, they have 2 weeks to file a petition with the National Labor Relations Board for some form of, presumably an election.
Yeah.
Within that period from when the cards are delivered to the election, if there are unfair labor practices, like we've seen time and time again,
yep,
practiced by the employer, the election takes place, or even, I guess, you could file beforehand. Maybe that's a question for Harold Meyerson. And if they find that, then boom, that's it. There is a union and a bargaining order.
Yep. And that's just a stick for these employees. Like, this is really a step forward, given what the dynamic that we've described. Like with Starbucks, for example, they have unlimited resources to get tied up in litigation surrounding their unfair labor practices, or in terms of like their, union busting, right? That's not going to solve the problem. The problem will be solved if there's an easier path to unionization that precludes them from engaging in the practices and then cleaning it up with money later.
Yeah, there's just sort of like a, it really makes it hard to union bust in the way that they've been doing it up to this point. They find a novel way of doing it. There was also a revival of an Obama era national labor relation regulation that speeds up the election process. So this isn't card check, but I think it's okay to call it card check light. It is pretty good. So this is good stuff. And again, this came out of a Cemex case. The Teamsters 2019 vote, narrowly defeated. And an administrative judge found in 2021 that Cemex had committed more than 24 unfair labor practices. the judge recommended setting aside the election results. What would happen now is the board would immediately say, we're going to issue a bargaining order. You've got a union because you crossed that threshold.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could address those unfair labor practices prior to the election. I'm not sure about that. We got to ask Harold Meyerson about that. But this is a big deal. And they did it just under the wire because the National Labor Relations Board is going to lose essentially its quorum to be able to make big policy changes. My understanding, and again, so I'll ask of Harold Meyerson, is that they're still going to be able to rule on stuff. And there'll still be a majority of Biden appointees versus Trump appointees. But they will be under the threshold they need to make major policy rules changes.
Okay.
We will check on that as well. So I got a lot of questions for Harold Meyerson tomorrow. But again, this is a big deal. And it's coming on the heels of the UAW brokering that tentative agreement with GM for battery maker. And we should also say that today or yesterday, maybe, guess it was yesterday, Trader Joe's United became the first union to request that the National Labor Relations Board issue a Cemex bargaining order against Trader Joe's. We don't know much else about this, but they filed the basis of the charges, right? Unfair labor practices. Some were like captive one-on-one meetings, captive audience meetings, prohibiting union literature on bulletin boards, prohibiting union literature on break room tables, prohibiting union campaigning 24 hours before the election. The basis of the charge, I can't even read, it was just an image, but this could be the first one where we see Trader Joe's get a bargaining order off this Cemex ruling. And it also applies to any pending applications for elections.
That's
or
incredible.
authorizations too. So this is good stuff.
So that applies to, even though this ruling is issued at the end of hot labor summer, as it's called, it applies to all the actions previously, right?
I mean, that Disney, and this is, doubly sort of delicious for me because Disney is trying to tear apart the solidarity between amongst the writers union and between the writers and actors. Full disclosure, I am a member of SAG-AFTRA. I have been for 30 years.
Wow.
Oh my God. It's terrifying. What?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just move on from that thought.
The visual effects crew at Disney Studios filed with the National Labor Relations Board for an election to unionize. A supermajority, 80% of the 18 in-house VFX crew members at Disney signed authorization cards. This is from, it was written up yesterday. So the ballots, they voted to unionize beginning August 21st. The election's going to happen. It's going to change. This is, they're going to, theoretically, Disney could say, okay, do it. And if they are now required, I guess, to file a petition saying we want to vote. It's going to be a big deal. We'll talk to Harold Meyerson about this more. But this is a big deal. Again, it's not card check, but card check would have required, I think, legislation. This is just returning to a version of a doctrine the National Labor Relations Board had 80 years ago, and it's a little bit, it gives employers just a little bit more, which I think also would probably put it under a threshold of like some type of judicial review. But I'm sure it'll be challenged, as all of these things are, because that's the nature of having a completely conservative-dominated Supreme Court. The flashy stuff is rolling back an individual right that has existed amongst about half our population for 50 years. But the stuff that goes under the radar for most people is stuff like this, stuff that is favorable to businesses. So this is a big deal.